Well, is everybody all right today? We haven't got much more time left in this course. And of course, we have a universe full of stuff that we could talk about. So we're just going to have to narrow some of these things down. As I indicated when we first started the course, the primary emphasis in this course is on the relationship between the Bible and modern science. That means that it's going to take another course to actually do very much with the subject of the relationship between God and modern science. But getting the relationship between the Bible and modern science is a very important step in being headed toward that direction. And before the end of the course, I'm going to show you some books that, as I say, if you want to get educated after taking this course, you can pick up some more books that actually deal more with the philosophical, theological question of how God and science are related since Darwin and since other scientific discoveries, since other scientific ventures like Freudianism and psychology and so forth. What we're going to do today is going to be based on this book by Roland Numbers entitled The Creationists, The Evolution of Scientific Creationism. Now, fortunately for you, I didn't require this as one of the books that you buy. If I required the books that I ordered just to prepare for this course, then your bill would have been about $1,000. And so I've kind of let you off easy. But if you're interested in a more extensive discussion of the creationists, this is the book. This is a book by Roland Numbers, who during his early life was a creationist, was a scientific creationist. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, so he was in the primary tradition out of which scientific creationism comes. Fundamentalism and modernism, last time I emphasized, you can go to the Presbyterian Church and find that battle. But scientific creationism originated not in one of the major denominations. It originated in Seventh-day Adventists. And Roland Numbers was one of those young guys who was being trained to be a scientific creationist, but he got too much training to stay one. And that's the reason why he's considered one of the best writers on the subject, because he has experiential understanding of all of the issues that are involved. However, you have another book which you were required to buy, which is also by Ronald Numbers. That is, he's one of the editors, and that's the book, if you remember, God and Nature, Historical Essays on the Encounter Between Christianity and Science. You remember that book you have in your library. And Numbers has an essay on that subject in that book. So what this book, Creationist, does is just expand on that essay. So in the light of what we discussed today in class about the evolution of creationism, you might want to go back and look up Ronald Numbers in your book, God and Nature, and seek confirmation of what I say. Or find out where I said something wrong, and you can come tell me about it. In the remaining classes, what we're going to do is focus on a couple of issues. One is the issue of the design argument, which is the latest rage in the battle between Darwinism and a newer form of creationism. This is not the same thing. The design movement is not the same thing as the Henry Morris creationist movement. It's on an entirely different level intellectually, scientifically, and philosophically. But it is causing lots of stir across the country. It's already caused, over the last few years, a stir at Baylor University, which you may have been reading about in the papers lately. So we'll spend one time talking about that. But in that class, we will focus on another book, which you also were not required to buy, and so I will reproduce some of the information from that book, and that's Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. I reminded you, or I told you somewhere in the beginning of this class, that he's one of the leaders in the new design movement, argument from design movement, and he is a well-respected scientist who has put out a book that has been very challenging for Darwinists to deal with. Of course, they, from their perspective, think that it's not difficult to deal with, but they're still. Michael Behe has not been thrown off of the field yet. He's still there, and so this will be an idea which we'll be developing, and in the light of that, his most important contribution is his discussion of the biochemical complexity of a bacterial flagellum. Now, what has that got to do with the argument? His argument is that Darwinism falls flat because it requires random variations and chance, and from his perspective, random variations and chance simply cannot produce something like the bacterial flagellum, which is an extremely complicated part of a bacterium. And from his perspective, this is irreducibly complex. And Darwin made the point, and this is why he calls it Darwin's black box. Darwin made the point that if there were something that was found to be irreducibly complex, then at least his theory of evolution would have a big hole shot in it. Well, Behe thinks he has come up with that, something that is irreducibly complex. Dembski, the other man, is working primarily in DNA and in the information in DNA, which he argues is also irreducibly complex. So if you come up with something irreducibly complex, according to these design people, you have come up with the fingerprint of God. Because if something cannot be produced by chance, by random variations, by any mechanism that Darwin has presented, or post-Darwin, or later Darwinians have presented, then at least you have the possibility that that is a fingerprint of God. It doesn't prove the existence of God, but what they're saying is you can legitimately talk about God even in science. You can't prove God's existence, but at least you can show that it's not an irrational or unreasonable thing to believe that some things cannot be explained except by the idea of intelligent design. So we'll look at that. That will be one of our classes.
What is it that he found? What is it that he found?
Irreducible complexity in various natural entities. The one that he one of his most favorites is the biochemical complexity of a bacterial flagellum. In other words, the tail of a bacteria is such a complex thing. It's much more complex, for instance, than an automobile transmission. And so the idea is that you're not. It's the same. It's a similar argument to the old Paley argument from design about the watch, but it's a little bit more sophisticated because he's not talking about a machine and using it as an analogy. He's talking about a very specific biological entity, which is singular, particular, and too complex to have originated according to the biological theories of Darwin. At least that's his argument. So that's the argument going around now. And I will show you a picture, an enlarged picture of this bacterial flagellum, and you'll see how many gears and so forth it takes for one of these things to operate. The idea of irreducible complexity is there are just too many things acting here at once for them to have been able to develop just by chance, just by the chance that is involved in random variations. Certainly not in the time span that we have. Well, that's the argument. That's the basic argument between a non-religious Darwinian and a religious Darwinian. Because he does believe in evolution, but he doesn't believe that evolution can be explained by any Darwinian mechanism totally.
In some of the discussions in the paper about the stuff at Baylor, my impression is that a lot of the new design stuff just deals with probability as one of the big components. Is that true?
Yes. Yes.
Because that seems kind of problematical. I mean, I've seen like the formula they came up to determine whether there was life on other planets. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I think Sagan did something about came up with this formula, which I was studied in an astronomy class. There were so many assumptions there that you could come up with just about any answer you wanted.
Yeah, in fact, that is one of the that's one of the argument of the design people, that this is much more complex than the Darwinians want it to be, because that means that there are all kinds of possible intrusions into science, maybe even a theological intrusion into science. But the main point that I want us to get out of this course is that theologians ought to be very cautious in intruding into natural science. They may be correct. These things may be the footprints or the fingerprints of God. But that is not essential to the Christian faith to prove that. It's not essential to the gospel to prove that. But again, that's not it's not my purpose in this course. That's going to take another whole course using different books to really get into any depth in that argument. I just want to introduce you to it through Behe. And then we want to spend one class period doing our debate. And the debate format is going to be very informal. That is a debate in which I would like everyone who is taking this course, both in class here, in Fort Bend, or over the ITV, to try to make it to class so that we will have a large roundtable kind of discussion in which people will feel free to make whatever contribution or ask any question or scream or whatever it is they feel like doing at any particular point in the discussion. But to me, that will be kind of a proof in the pudding that we actually have read some of this material and we've thought about it. And that will also show the complexity of this subject. Because if we have 40 people, we won't have 40 people here, but if we have 40 people here, then you're going to have 40 different perspectives as to what we've learned, which to me is exciting. To some people that's confusing, but to me that's exciting. And so I want those 40 people to be able to, ask a question or get shocked by something or say something about it. Yeah.
Is that still going to be next Tuesday?
It's going to be the next Tuesday.
21st.
But then the next to the last class will be talking specifically and hopefully in more depth about Jay Gould's book, Stephen Jay Gould's book, which is a book which attempts to solve the issue of how religion is to be related to the Bible and to that religion is to be related to science. And he has a pretty good proposal. I like his proposal. It's called non-overlapping magisteria. The word magisteria, if you've read the book, what is he using? What is that? What's that expression? Where does that expression come from?
As in a realm.
Okay, it's
As in a realm.
Yeah, and it's a realm, and it's primarily used these days, since it's a Latin word, magisterium. It's primarily used these days in reference to the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church. In other words, the teaching office of the Roman Catholic Church. What he's suggesting is that science has a magisterium. It has a teaching office. It has its realm in which it is supreme. It is authoritative. And that should be done by scientists. That shouldn't be done by theologians as theologians. Now, some theologians are also scientists, as are all of the people whose books we're reading. And so these people can get into science. But what Gould is saying is that there's also a religious magisterium. And there are religious issues that only religious thinkers can deal with. Now, some of these religious thinkers may also be scientists, but there's still a magisterium. They can't overlap. They have to work in their area. I think that's a pretty good model, and we're going to try to explore that model. And in fact, that is what you're going to write your last paper on, is the magisterium model in Stephen Jay Gould. And what you're going to do is to try to state it in a way that shows, in an efficient and precise way that shows that you know what the proposal is he's making, and also do your own critique of it. In other words, there may be a part of it that you think doesn't work. For instance, to me, there is a major part of it that doesn't work. I think the thing as a whole is a very workable place to start. But to me, there's a major part of it that doesn't work, and that is that when all is said and done, Stephen Jay Gould doesn't stick with his magisterium. At the end of his book, he actually tries to determine how religious people define religion. Well, if you're going to give religion completely to the religious magisterium, then you're going to have to let them define religion. So that, just his book shows the value of this model, but at the same time it shows some of the problems in working this model out. So we'll talk about Jay Gould. And then we will spend the last class trying to wrap up what we've been doing in this class, trying to say what it means, or what we've looked at means in relationship to our understanding of how the Bible and modern science are related. So that's kind of a vision of what we're going to be doing the rest of the semester. But let's look now at the evolution of creationism. By the late 19th century, evolutionary notions were infiltrating even the ranks of evangelical Christians. And in the opinion of many observers, belief in special creation seemed destined to go the way of the dinosaur. That's certainly what people like Thomas Huxley keenly desired, was that special creation go the way of the dinosaur, because that is what Charles Darwin attempted to do in his Origin of the Species, to undercut any doctrine of special creation. But special creation, I've been very painstakingly trying to inform you, is not the same thing as scientific creationism. Special creation is the traditional view that God created everything in a kind of fiat way. But scientific creationism has added a great many bells and whistles to that idea. And so that's what we're looking for, as to how that particular way of handling the Bible developed. Contrary to the hopes of liberals and the fears of conservatives, creationism did not become extinct. In fact, there are more creationists. There are more people today than there were when this battle was going on, but there are also more creationists today than there were when Darwin put his theory of evolution out. And not only that, but there are more educated creationists today than there were at that time. though most of the educated scientists at the time of Darwin, members of the Royal Society, were also creationists. Richard Owen, all of these guys were special creationists. In other words, they believed no matter how old the earth was, God in some way specially created the various kinds of animals and organisms, and there may have been some kind of evolution or developed since, but there is no evidence, they believed, either in the geological record or even any rational philosophical methodology that can come to the conclusion of Darwin. So Darwin's main fight was not with preachers. He didn't even know very many preachers. His main fight were with the orthodox scientists of England. And as we saw in the quote from Thomas Huxley last week when he was talking to Charles Kingsley, his pastor in the Church of England, Huxley really hoped that people like Kingsley were going to be able to prepare the Church of England to get rid of the idea of special creation and to come into conformity more with modern science. Well, Kingsley managed to do that in most Anglicanism. But the irony is that liberals in the 19th and early 20th century thought that since liberalism was the wave of the future, most people by the end of the 20th century would be liberals who had given up special creation and had gone to scientific evolution. Historically, that has not happened. What has happened is the reverse. The denominations that are dying in terms of numerical growth in America are the liberal denominations. The ones that are exploding in terms of numerical growth are those denominations who will tend to believe in some way in special creation. So their hopes just didn't come true. And one of the reasons why their hopes didn't come true is because of the rise of scientific creationism. But scientific creationism is now a dinosaur even among evangelicals, because other movements have taken its place, as we're going to see. Creationism did not become extinct. Following the Scopes monkey trial, as I indicated last time, there was just kind of the assumption among liberals and intellectuals that that was the death of anti-evolutionism, but that was actually the birth. That was actually the critical point. And what happened was that anti-evolutionists kind of went back into the woods and licked their wounds and produced children that now have PhDs in science. And so you've got all kinds of problems that you didn't have before in trying to convince people of Darwin's theory of evolution. Besides the unexpected revival in recent years, which caught even enthusiasts by surprise, even people like Henry Morris did not realize how effective he was going, how famous he was going to become. The most striking development in the history of 20th century creationism is the ascendancy since the early 1960s of a distinctive brand of creationism known as scientific creationism or creation science. Now, to show you why this is connected with the 1960s and not with 1860s, I want to show a little chart here, and I don't know if we can see it on the camera or not, but I will go over it a little bit, and you can check it out in your reading. What I have here is a chart on interpretations of Genesis by creationists, and only one of these interpretations is Henry Morris's interpretation. Henry Morris's interpretation is the most recent one. There are three major interpretations that have been held by fundamentalist Christians since the rise of fundamentalism. One is the day-age theory. Now, in a sense, the day-age theory was inaugurated by more liberal Christians. But also more moderate fundamentalists also accepted the day-age theory. And he lists at the right some of the people who accepted it. But the day-age theory simply means that the day in Genesis 1 represents not a 24-hour day, but an eon, as in eons ago. An eon is a long period of time, can be an indefinite period of time. For instance, we talk about the Jurassic period. Well, then we talk about the Cambrian period. Well, those periods don't have to be any specific number of years. It just depends on what happened and how you make those classifications. And so already there were fundamentalists who accepted the day-age theory. Among those fundamentalists who accepted the day-age theory was William Jennings Bryan, which is the reason why he got into so much trouble at the Scopes monkey trial, because he didn't represent many of the fundamentalists that he was representing. When Clarence Darrow got a hold of William Jennings Bryan on the stand, for instance, he started asking him about geology, and what was William Jennings Bryan's famous comeback? I'm more interested in the rock of ages than in the age of rocks. Well, that sounds like a pious statement, but it's actually a wiggly statement, because William Jennings Bryan believed that the earth was very old. He was not a young earth creationist. But he didn't want to make that statement on the stand because most of the people in his audience, most of the people who had hired him, were young earth creationists. The same thing is true when Clarence Darrow asked him, asked him about Cain's wife. Where did she come from? And what was William Jennings Bryan's reply to that in the Scope monkey trial? Well, I'll let the agnostics hunt for her. Well, he had his own opinions and his views, and his views were much more moderate than the people who he was defending. But his primary interest in that case was defending the rights of the people who sent their kids to school in Dayton, Tennessee. So he tried not to get into these differences among creationists. So he believed that the days could have been any number of years. And so he could have allowed for hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years for the development of the world. But he did believe that human beings, and he didn't really argue that much in any other case, but he did believe that human beings, in order to keep their dignity, their theological, spiritual dignity, had to be created directly by God. So it's in that sense that he was a creationist, a special creationist. But he literally didn't care how old rocks were. So that wasn't just a smart aleck remark. That was to get Darrow off the subject, because he didn't want to testify to that matter. And according to the day-age theory, matter was created eons ago, and then life was created maybe eons later, and then humans were created maybe eons later. Well, that leaves room for lots of geological strata. That leaves room for lots of fossil records. But one thing that these people argued, which was their most powerful argument, and it still is that at the time of Darwin, the fossil record did not produce enough evidence to sustain Darwin's theory. And there's another little verse right under that. After 150 years, the fossil record still does not produce enough evidence to sustain Darwin's theory. And so Stephen Jay Gould has had to go to another theory, the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Because what the fossil records show is that something comes into existence, just, just is there. And then it's the same way for millions of years. And then it is, say it becomes extinct, and something else seems to appear kind of out of nowhere and continues for millions of years. So what these creationists believe is that the earth can be millions of years old. They don't care how old it is. But that the fossil record itself indicates that there might have been some special creations along the way that took the place, if you're going to rationalize it, took the place of extinctions. Because the animals that appear stay the same for millions of years. So what Stephen Jay Gould has done is he's put a little kicker in his theory so that his theory more conforms to the fossil record than Darwin's theory does. His theory is that there is an equilibrium for millions of years, but then there's something that triggers an explosion of evolutionary creativity. And so he has not been converted to creationism, but he has had to adjust his theory in the light of the way creationists said he had to adjust it. All right, that's the day-age theory. The day-age theory also believes in Noah's flood. They believed that Noah's flood was literal. But interestingly enough, again, the day-age theory fundamentalists, some of them allow that Noah's flood was a local flood and not a universal flood. So it could not have been the source of the fossil record. Henry Morris thinks that the flood is the source of the fossil record, and it's the source of the geological strata. So again, when you think of creationism, you have to go back behind Henry Morris, who's only been important since the 60s. And I was around before the 60s. And there were creationists around before the 60s. But a lot of the creationists were day-age creationists. And a lot of them today are day-age creationists. Hugh Ross, for instance, is the most famous fundamentalist or evangelical scientist today. He's an astronomer. He has a program on the Christian TV channel every week, maybe every day. I catch it every once in a while. But he believes that the universe is 14 to 15 billion years old. He believes that the earth is millions of years old. He believes that human beings, that is, Homo sapiens, he allows the same age for Homo sapiens as scientists do. He just does not allow Homo sapiens to develop from ape-like creatures. So he still holds to special creation for human beings. Okay, that's one very legitimate concept of special creation that fundamentalists still had before Henry Morris. The other is the gap or ruin restoration. By the way, the day-age creation was held by John William Dawson. It was held by Louis Agassiz, the Harvard professor. It was held by William Jennings Bryan. It was held by George Frederick Wright. And William Jennings Bryan and George Frederick Wright were both writers in the Fundamentals. So there weren't any creation scientists writing in the Fundamentals. There were day-age theorists writing in the Fundamentals. Now the gap or ruin restoration was also a very widespread. Yes, go ahead.
The gap or what?
Gap or ruin and restoration. Let me write that out so you can. The gap theory or the ruin and restoration theory. Now, if you remember when you were reading your Bible and you were reading Genesis 1, the first verse says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Then the next phrase says what? the next clause, the earth was without form and void. The Hebrew there can be translated, the earth became without form and void. Aha, what does that leave? That leaves a huge gap in one verse. So from that, C.I. Scofield, whose Bible was the most popular Bible among fundamentalists in the early part of this century, and you can still buy Scofield Bibles all over the place. And I have an older edition of it. C.I. Scofield was noted for two things. One is he was noted for the gap theory of creation, and he was also noted for dispensational premillennialism, which are two of the dispensational premillennialism is one of the very important religious ideas in today's United States political arena, because most of the religious right are dispensational premillennialists. Most of the Israeli lobby in America are Christian dispensational premillennialists. So that's the reason. The reason why Israel gets almost all of the empathy and sympathy from Americans is not so much because the Jewish lobby is so powerful. The Jewish lobby is really not that powerful. But the Christian right lobby is more powerful. There are, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 million Christian right people who believe in dispensational premillennialism, so they believe that anything Israel does, they're on Israel's side. So you don't get much sympathy from them for
what exactly is dispensational premillennialism?
Okay, I've talked about premillennialism a little bit, but dispensational premillennialism, just very quickly, is the belief that the world is coming very close to its end, and that the end of the world began with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. That, according to dispensational premillennialism, was the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Bible that was most significant so far in history, the establishment of the State of Israel. Because according to them, before the end of the world can come, before the Messiah can come, Israel must be reestablished as a state. Now this is one area where Christian fundamentalists and Orthodox Jews are in complete agreement. The Messiah must come and establish his throne in Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. And so that's the reason why Christian fundamentalists have such empathy with Orthodox Jews. They don't have near as much empathy with the secular Jews of Israel, but they have a lot of empathy with the Orthodox Jews. And that's the reason why in any political issue, they are actually generally more on the side of the Orthodox Jewish position, for instance, on peace or war or anything else, or on land. Christian fundamentalists do not want near as much land given up as the State of Israel has suggested. For the same reason, Orthodox Jews do not want that much land given up. So the idea is that with the beginning of the State of Israel, a prophecy clock began to tick down. And eventually, that clock will come to the point of what is called the rapture. And the rapture, in 1900, there were probably only a few hundred or a few thousand people who believed in the rapture. But now there are millions of people who believe in the rapture, and there is now a set of books that is selling almost as many copies as some of these other explosions on the market. What is the name of that set of books? I shouldn't even start.
Left Behind series.
Left Behind. The Left Behind series. And that's going to be put into into movie form, and those are books about the rapture. And a lot of Americans think that is a view held by just a few screwballs. That is not a view held by just a few screwballs. That is a view held by millions of conservative Christians. And it has a tremendous effect, it's had a tremendous effect on the history of American politics. In the 1890s, or 1880s, when was Benjamin Harrison president? Anyway, in the late 19th century, there were few people who believed in the reestablishment of the State of Israel as a fulfillment of prophecy. They went to Benjamin Harrison and tried to get him to declare for a state of Israel. And that was the beginning of the relationship between dispensational premillennialist and our political system. Jimmy Carter probably lost the presidency because he said the wrong thing about one of the reasons was because he said the wrong thing about the relationship of Israel to the Arabs. And his constituency, which was largely evangelical, many of them deserted him in the next election. But the rapture simply means that at some point in the near future, and these people like the ones like the Hayes who have written these books on Left Behind, are expecting at any moment. What is going to happen is that we're going to be sitting in this classroom. Now, I'm not going to make a judgment on this, I'm just trying to describe it. We're sitting in this classroom, and all of a sudden, I disappear. You're left, of course, but I disappear. And so you're going to be sitting there without anything to do, because what has happened is I have been raptured. What has happened is that I have been raptured, that is, I have been taken up. Rapture is a word which is kind of related to ecstasy, that is, that I'm carried up and out of the earth. And I'm just not there anymore. So everybody that's left is left with the question of why I'm not here anymore. And they may have heard some of their premillennial Christian friends talking about this before, but of course they paid no attention to it. They may have been driving down the highway and they came up behind this Lincoln Town car that said, "In case of rapture, this car will be unmanned." That's the reason why I follow Lincoln Town cars around every once in a while. But anyway, when in case of rapture, this town car will be unmanned. Because that is not a symbolic event. That is a literal event for dispensational Christians. And then following that, there will be a period of tribulation. And there are different views on the tribulation, but the tribulation will last for 7 years. And it will be the most horrible period in human history, in which people will be killed by the millions, people will suffer by the millions, and ultimately it will end with the Battle of Armageddon, and Christ will appear kind of at the height of the Battle of Armageddon, defeat the enemies of the Messiah, reestablish the kingdom of David with headquarters in Israel, with headquarters in Jerusalem. That's the reason why Jerusalem ain't going to go to the Arabs from the perspective of Orthodox Jews and premillennial Christians. It does not belong to the Arabs. It belongs to the Jews, and the Jews need to get it ready for the coming of the Messiah. And where is the temple going to be rebuilt? What now stands on the place where the temple is going to be rebuilt? The Dome of the Rock, the mosque, and the mosque. And so if that temple is rebuilt, there's going to be a fuss. And so this is not just a political issue. This is a very deep religious schism. And there are people preparing for this at this moment. There are Orthodox Jews who have already designed and and produced the robes for the priests for the new temple. There is already they have already located the red heifers that are going to be sacrificed in order to dedicate the temple, and they located the red heifers on a farm of a dispensational Christian in America, and they have already been delivered to Israel. So you may be thinking you're going to be graduating next year, but but you better rethink your position, because there may not be a graduation next year. Anyway, that's a serious belief of millions of Christians, and it's amazing to me how many Americans don't know much about that. That's dispensational premillennialism. Yes.
How long is the tribulation? 1,000 years?
No, tribulation's 7 years. The 1,000 years is the millennial reign. That's what millennium means, 1,000 years. Yes.
Is that supposed to coincide with the 7 plagues, or?
Yeah, the 7 plagues would take place during the tribulation. And they are horrible things. Those of us who are left at the rapture, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go to hell or that we're lost. But it does mean we better start thinking pretty fast, because we need to get ourselves into proper relationship to God, because we're going to be undergoing the tribulation. So we're in for it if we're not making the rapture. The people who make the rapture will, in a sense, be observers of the tribulation. But there will still be people saved during the tribulation. But it's going to be because the shock of the rapture is going to put the fear of God into some of us. You want to say something?
So I wanted to ask, is the dispensation, the people who are enjoying this dispensation are just being excused from the 7 years? Is that what the dispensation is?
No, dispensationalism refers to the fact that history is divided into various dispensations. And we are now living in the dispensation of grace, or the church dispensation. We've been living in the church dispensation since the death of Christ and the establishment of the church. So we're living in the church dispensation. The other dispensation will be the millennium. Dispensation just means a period of time, a theologically significant period of time. Now, I didn't know I was going to get into that, but that is important to understand who it is who believes this gap theory. It's people who are associated with C.I. Scofield and who are therefore also dispensational premillennialists. There are premillennialists who are not quite as methodical in their interpretation of the Bible. There are premillennialists who are simply called simple premillennialists or traditional premillennialists, who believe that Christ will come again and establish a 1,000-year reign, but they don't tie it so strictly to the events that are now occurring in Israel.
It seems like there's a distinguishing factor between those who go into the rapture and those that may be associated as a Christian but don't go. I mean, is there some type of thing you have to do?
Yeah, well, the only way I can describe it is that some people are more born again than others. In other words, some people are really not born again. If you're truly born again, then you will go with the rapture. But you may be a kind of a lukewarm Christian who is Christian only in name, and so a lot of those folks will be left. But they will have kind of a little advantage, because they will at least have heard of this idea. And when it happens, then they will know that it's true, whereas before they were skeptical. And for instance, there was a Pentecostal church in California. I forget which particular denomination it was. But they, in their deed, have willed their church building to the Presbyterian church down the street. The assumption being that most of the Pentecostals will be in the rapture, but they don't want their church building to go to complete pagans. So, so they're going to let the Presbyterians have it. Now that's an actual fact. You can interpret it the way you want to, but that's a good thing. When I went to last time I went to get a church loan for my house, refinancing for my house, the man who gave me the loan was a dispensational premillennialist, so I had a nice conversation with him. But one time during the conversation, what?
Take it. Don't worry about paying it back.
Well, that's what I was going to tell him. He was worried about whether I had good credit, and I said, "What difference does it make?" But anyway, he still had to check my credit out. But anyway, we kind of smile at this, but it's really nothing to smile about. It's a serious view of the world by a great many Christians. Okay, let's get back to the ruin and restoration. What does that mean? That means that you can explain all of the fossils that are millions of years old. You can even explain a pre-Adamic race of human beings. There could be anything in that gap. Anything. There could be visitors from outer space in that gap. And so what they're doing is completely nullifying what they're trying to do is to completely nullify the conflict between science and religion. And that's one way to do it. To allow for the fact that they were a pre-Adamic race, and so we're digging up their bones all the time. But the Adamic race has only been around a few thousand years, and it was specially created by God. In other words, all of this other stuff was preparation. And we don't know why God used all this time for preparation. That's a problem that anybody who doesn't believe the young earth theory has, is trying to decide why God took so long to do this. And the answer to that is, I don't know. And so that's the answer these people will give. But it is an interesting theory that a lot of Christians hold that is very different from Henry Morris's theory. And so when you talk about creationism, you have to include this in the mix. And then, yes?
Do they then believe in the flood and then also wiping out pretty much everybody and starting all over again?
Yes. But again, they are not dependent upon the flood for all of the answers to geology. In fact, they can believe in a local flood. Because a local flood actually does what the Bible flood is supposed to do, and that is wipe out most of human beings, because that's where most of the human beings were from their perspective. That's certainly where civilization was. And there are people right now looking at places in that area for evidence of a very huge local flood. I don't mean like a flood like we have in Kingwood. I mean a very huge local flood that actually changed the geography and the geology of a whole section of the world, and therefore would have been possibly would have resulted in a tremendous amount of destruction and probably a great loss of life. And they believe that they have established that, which means, from their perspective, whether or not there is a God, there was a great local flood, to which the Bible is pointing. Because when you get right down to it, even if somebody proves that there's a flood, that doesn't prove the existence of God. You still have to, come to faith in God in a different way. Because flood geology doesn't prove the existence of God any more than any other kind of geology does. It doesn't disprove the existence of God, but it doesn't prove it. So the third kind of creationist is the one that we've been dealing with as kind of the extreme in the relationship between the Bible and science. And that is flood geology, or creation science. Now, even these people sometimes allow for a long period of a lifeless earth. But they believe in 6 literal days of the creation of life. In other words, when God created the heavens and the earth, you can still have lots of time. But from their perspective, the geological evidence of the flood and other evidences, primarily biblical chronology or biblical genealogies, means that the appearance of life was just a few thousand years ago. And so there has not been any time for any kind of mechanism like Darwinism to work, because if present human beings have only been around a few thousand years, they've been the same for all those thousands of years. So they must have been created by special creation. But then in this view, Noah's flood figures very importantly, because in this view, Noah's flood answers all the questions of extensive fossil records and geological strata and so forth. Because the flood is not an ordinary event. It's not the kind of flood these people are looking for right now. It is a universal flood which has not only all natural elements but has supernatural elements. And if God wants to mess up the earth and shake it up, He can do it. So there's no problem from their perspective with believing in a universal flood. Yes?
I have a question. In the Bible, I haven't read the passage on that, but does it say anything more than 40 days and 40 nights of rain? Because Morris is talking about volcanism, all kinds of cataclysms that I didn't think was talked about in the Bible.
No, it's not talked about in the Bible. That's an inference. But it's an inference which shows the scientific character of scientific creationism, because it is dealing with issues that the Bible is not concerned about. In other words, no one in the Bible time was even reading the fossil record. And so there wouldn't have been any need for explaining the fossil record in the writing of Genesis. Just like there was no need of explaining the process by which life came into the world or anything like that. But if you are scientifically minded people, like the creationists are, they're scientifically minded people. They live after the rise of modern science. They have gone through the Enlightenment. So they've got to, in some way, establish their views scientifically. And they do this through inference. That if you have a universal flood in which there are gigantic natural forces combined with supernatural forces, then whatever came out of that flood explains the geological record. All the way from the Grand Canyon to continental drift to whatever it is you want. Yes?
I mean, with that perspective, I mean, anything that's not eliminated as possible, as having happened in the Bible, is possible, including
right.
evolution. So,
That's right.
I mean,
Well,
seems like that's kind of, by adding this stuff to explain why just a simple flood couldn't have, accommodated for anything. It seems like it's sort of an after the fact
the
kind of
flood
explanation.
has to accommodate everything because they're not going to allow for evolution. They're not going to allow even for a long period of the existence of life, and certainly not for a long period of the existence of human beings. So the flood has to account for other things, and it does that in the following way. For instance, if you go to the tops of mountains, you find geological strata in which there are fish. Aha, well. That can be explained 2 different ways, they say. That could be explained in the uniformitarian way, and that is that for millions and millions of years, the earth has been shifting and building mountains, and these mountains have been built out of land that used to be ocean bottoms, and so that's the reason why you have fish fossils. Or It can be explained by the flood. So that's why the flood is so important. That is, the flood deposited fish on the top of mountains. Now, how do you disprove that? You don't. You either accept a certain presupposition about how the earth operates, or you don't. Okay, let's define creationism in this third. Yes.
I know you said they believe in 6-day creation, but is that a literal 24-hour day?
Yes. Literal 24-hour days 6,000 years ago. So that means from their perspective, the oldest animals are a few thousand years old. So there's no time possibility of evolutionary development. Now, the definition of creationism that we're going to use is their own definition. In 1981, they wrote a law that was passed in the Arkansas legislature defining what they thought needed to be taught in public schools. And this is where this definition comes from. As defined in the 1981 Arkansas law, quote, creation science includes the scientific evidences and related inferences that indicate. Inferences is very important because, as you say, the Bible doesn't say anything specifically about this, but it does talk about things that you can infer things from. First, sudden creation of the universe, energy and life from nothing. Well, that could almost be covered by the Big Bang Theory, but not quite. Because from their perspective, this sudden creation of the universe in energy and life from nothing, at least the life part, took place just a few thousand years ago. 2, the insufficiency of mutation and natural selection in bringing about development of all living kinds from a single organism. In other words, they're saying, the reason why our scientific theory needs to be in school is because your scientific theory doesn't answer the question. We can't prove ours either. So we can't prove ours either, but you can't prove yours. And so if you're going to educate your children properly, or at least if you're going to satisfy the parents of children that are sending their schools to schools that they support and build with their own money, they ought to be able to learn both models. That's what they call them, models of creation, or models of origins. There's the creation model, there's the evolutionary model. 3, changes only within fixed limits of originally created kinds of plants and animals. Now, they used to use the word species. In other words, before there was a great deal of critique of creationism, they would argue that species are the original animals. But they have now backed off from that because the Hebrew word is not species. The Hebrew word is best translated kind. And so from their perspective, kind might include some development of species. But there were a number of original kinds developed by fiat creation. In other words, there's no time, and God doesn't want evolution to take place from a single cell or from a single life form. If there's no time for it, and if, as these Christians believe, God wouldn't want that, if there was time for it, then that did not occur. And so every living thing comes from a kind. Now, but another corollary of that is that there is separate ancestry for man and apes. In other words, man and apes look like they might come from the same kind, but that's theologically unacceptable. And so man and apes come from different kinds. that's kind of a problem with the theory of kinds because of all kinds, it seems like man and apes are among the closest. But you still have to separate human beings from any other kind. A human being is a kind sui generis in itself. But again, that's theological reasons. But from their perspective, a theological justification that can't be proved is just as good as a philosophical or a scientific justification that can't be proved. And so they want their children taught both. 5, explanation of the Earth's geology by catastrophism, including the occurrence of a worldwide flood. Now you see, they have distinguished themselves from the other two kinds of fundamentalist creationism. In other words, you know who wrote this law. It wasn't William Jennings Bryan. It wasn't C.I. Scofield. It was Henry Morris and his school. And that's one of the mistakes they made, is tailoring the law too much to Henry Morris's school, because that's not even the whole school of Christian fundamentalism. And so what the judge can easily say then is that this is a particular religious perspective that is not even held by all fundamentalists, much less all Christians. And therefore it cannot be, because of the law because of the First Amendment, it cannot be allowed in school, because if you allowed this in school, what else would you have to allow? Well, you would have to allow a Scofieldite to come teach his brand. You would have to allow a Buddhist to come teach his brand. You'd have to allow a liberal Christian to come teach his brand. So from the judge's perspective, this is a political, legal problem. It's not a theological issue. From his perspective, he cannot make the judgment as to whether Henry Morris is correct or not. That's irrelevant. A judge can't make a judgment about whether Henry Morris is correct or not. He can only make a judgment about whether this is science or whether this is religion. And if it is religion, then it cannot be ordered taught in public schools. Now, the interesting thing about this politically is that Henry Morris and his school of scientific creationists really, historically and politically, shot themselves in the foot. Because there was more freedom in the United States to teach scientific creationism in public schools until Henry Morris wrote this law. When he wrote this law and had it passed by the Arkansas legislature, then it had to go to federal court. And if you want freedom to do something, you better do it before some court rules on it. And so the fact of the matter is that people in country schools were much freer to teach scientific creationism before this law was put into effect. But the problem is, now, since this law was put into effect, there have now been 2 laws that were passed by legislatures that have been declared unconstitutional by the court. And so individual local schools have much more interest now in trying to keep creationism out of the public school than they did before. But people have a way of doing that. You know, they have a way of shooting themselves in the foot. And one way to shoot yourself in the foot, as you can tell by some things going on right now, is get yourself in court. Because when you put yourself in court, then you have to abide by the court's decision. At least the last court. You have to abide by the last Court of Appeals decision. And so there was much more freedom in Arkansas to teach creationism before this law went to court. Yes?
Do you think they really had in mind getting scientific creationism taught, or more in having evolution taking them out.
No.
Indicating they're equivalent and then having evolution removed.
No, they are politically astute enough to know that you're not going to pass a law taking evolution out of schools. And so this is an equal law. This is the law of equality. In the Scopes monkey trial, that's what Clarence Darrow and the ACLU were arguing for. Equal presentation. But the ACLU has since changed its mind. It does not want equal presentation. It wants only evolution presented. So these guys know that that is the state of the law. And so they're putting themselves forward. You may agree or disagree with it, with their own characterization, but they're putting themselves forward as the tolerant people in this fight. The evolutionists are the intolerant ones. They are willing to allow evolution to be taught alongside of creationism, but the evolutionists are not tolerant enough to allow creationism to be taught alongside evolution. That's their position. So that's the way the laws were written, equal. In a sense, evolutionists have also shot themselves in the foot in these battles, because if they could have worked out some creative solution, such as the ones that have been suggested by William Nord, the great religion professor from North Carolina. If they had worked out some kind of creative solution to where somewhere in the curriculum of the school a child would be able to hear the familiar sounds of his own view, say in a history of religion course or in a history of the philosophy of science course or something like that, or just in a history course, then the fight may have been largely over. But they fought these laws tooth and toenail, and so now the creationists have begun another tack. Now they are stripping the teaching of evolution of its potency. That's what happened in Kansas. In Kansas, you cannot outlaw the teaching of evolution in public schools, but you can pass a law saying that students don't have to be tested over it. And that's what happened in Kansas. Now, and so the fight is still a very virulent fight. And there are some evolutionists, there are some anti-evolutionists who hope that eventually evolution will not be taught in American public schools, because they hope to overturn its validity to the degree that their overturning of it will become the consensus of orthodox science. That's really what Dempsey and Behe believe and Johnson. They really believe that through their efforts and the efforts of whoever succeeds them, eventually orthodox Darwinism will be perceived as invalid by orthodox scientists, in which case they will have won the battle. I mean, they would have won the war, even though they've lost the battles as they've gone along. 6, a relatively recent inception of the earth and of living kinds. Until the last few decades, most creationists would have regarded such notions as unnecessarily extreme. William Jennings Bryan would have considered this an extreme view. By the late 19th century, even the most conservative Christian apologists readily conceded that the Bible allowed for an ancient earth and pre-Edenic life. With few exceptions, they accommodated the findings of historical geology either by interpreting the days of Genesis 1 to represent vast ages in the history of the earth, or by separating a creation in the beginning from a much later Edenic creation in 6 literal days. Those are the day-age theory and the gap theory. Now, I will spend some time in the next class period talking about the actual history of the rise of creation science, which has to do with its history in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Because if you'll notice, Ellen G. White is listed as one of the originators of this. She was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we'll talk about that relationship next time.